Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World, the Practical Voice Podcast. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while and you are genuinely passionate about voice, or if you've been working in this industry for a while and you know your stuff, then you'll know that voice is more than smart speakers. Voice is an interface, and it's cropping up in all kinds of different devices, from headphones to watches to mobile phones to clocks and microwaves and washing machines and, of course, the web. Now, if you want to bring voice to the web, if you want to bring voice to your website or your client's website, then Speebly will help you do that. In the same way as you get the little chatbot icons that are in the bottom right-hand corners of websites that open up a text-based chatbot, the Speebly widget is that, but with voice capability. It's essentially a voice assistant embedded on your website. Depending on the conversation and how the conversation goes, it can take you to different pages on your website and actually navigate a user through your website based on the conversation. Or if you're using Dialogflow for your Google Assistant actions or Amazon Alexa skills, then you can point Dialogflow at Speebly and access that skill or action through Speebly, which means that essentially you'll have your skill or your action available to be interacted with via a website. Plenty of you are working with clients, helping them build conversational experiences, and Speebly have an offer for VUX World listeners where if you include Speebly as part of your client work, as part of a project that you're working on with a client, and your client then uses the Speebly widget on their website, Speebly will give you, the developer or the designer or the company who has created the widget, they will give you a kickback every single month. It's good for the client because they get to show that they're innovative, they get to have voice as part of their website, they get to have something that is more engaging than clicking through pages. It's good for the user because they have that different interaction and they have an assistant that can help them navigate through the website, and it's good for you because you get paid. It's a fantastic tool. Check it out. Go to speebly.com/VUX to find out more. That's Speebly, SPEEBLY.com/VUX. On today's episode of VUX World, we are getting deep into how to localize and internationalize Alexa skills. We've touched on localization in the past. We did a VUI design localization episode with Micah DeFua. We've looked deep into the jargon tool with Jargon. Today, we're looking specifically at Alexa skill localization. We're going to go through the how to take a skill from a language into another language. We're going to be talking about cultural considerations, design considerations, front-end considerations, back-end considerations, and walk you through the entire process, as well as the challenges and the gotchas and the benefits and reasons why you should do it. Now, to take us through it, and there's a rhyme, to take us through it, we are speaking to Alexa Evangelists Andrea Muttoni and Herman Viscuso. Andrea is a senior solutions architect and a technical evangelist for Alexa UK and Ireland, and Herman is the technical evangelist for Alexa Spain. Now, the background with these guys is unbelievable. Herman is from Argentina, living in Spain, has a German passport, and I think is it a German passport? I think it is. And Andrea has been brought up in about 6 different countries, from China to America to Luxembourg to all over the world. These guys are. I don't think there's people who are in a better position to discuss localization and translating or transcreating of your Alexa skills. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Andrea Muttoni and Herman Viscuso on VUX World.
VUX World. VUX World. VUX World. VUX World. Branding with the big faces. I love listening to it. Kane Sims, the one and only. Britain's finest, Mr. Kane Sims. Dustin Coates.
I like it when you guys are together and talking about voice.
Without further ado,
welcome to the show.
Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to the podcast. Today, Dustin, how are you feeling today?
Feeling pretty good. How about you, Kane?
Feeling pretty good. I'm a little bit not under the weather in terms of my mental state or my health, but I'm under the weather in terms of my physical location because there is a huge grey cloud outside that has been raining on me all day. But my day is about to be brightened up, and yours is as well. Welcome to the podcast, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Andrea Muttoni and Herman Viscuso of Amazon Alexa. Andrea, Herman, welcome.
Thank you.
thank you.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure to have you along for the journey today. We've got a lot to talk about. Localization. We've covered localization a couple of times on the podcast, but we've never really made it Amazon Alexa specific. And of everyone at Amazon Alexa, of the 10,000 people I think it was reported that were working at Amazon Alexa, you guys are the localization kings. Are we right?
Sort of.
Absolutely.
Well, I think you must be something like that, because Andrea, I was looking at your LinkedIn and you've grew up in Italy, France, the UK, the USA, China, and Luxembourg.
Yeah. So I've had a bit of a peculiar upbringing. My father, he kind of brought us around as a family when we were growing up. And we kind of just, I especially went to the local schools wherever I went, except for China, where it was a bit hard to go in high school, in Chinese. So I went to the international school there, but it helped me adapt to the culture quite well, and definitely contributed to me being a fan of localization for sure.
Andrea is a typical expat. I also have like a kind of weird background because I was born in Argentina and I moved to Spain. I live in Madrid right now, and I have an Italian passport, so it's kind of a mix. And I always work for foreign companies, so yeah, it's globalization,
This is globalization. And Dustin is from USA. He's living in Paris. I think I'm the only one over here who's just boring, I think.
Just born and raised.
Yeah, I'm just boring. I've got no story like this. I mean, you guys are literally, not only in terms of your work at Amazon and in the Alexa team evangelizing for localization, but in terms of your background and your experience, you actually are in the perfect position to be the ones advising on this.
But you know what, Kane? It's actually a double-edged sword, because I grew up, so I'm Italian born. And speaking of passports, I have a German passport for some reason, and I've never lived in Germany. But I'm Italian born, and I grew up in the States, so I picked up this American accent. And when I go to Italy, people ask me where I'm from. And when I go to the US, people ask me where I'm from, because they can't place my accents in either language anywhere. So I basically feel like I'm part of no country, or optimistically, part of all countries.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, just like I told you, like the typical expat, nobody knows where you are from.
Classic. So let's kind of back up a little bit then, and we'll kind of discuss a little bit of your kind of backgrounds and stuff to give the users context. As if they need more context, you've both kind of lived all over the world and hold passports for all kinds of different countries. But we'll start with you, Herman. Tell us a little bit about your background and your experience to date, and some of the stuff that you're doing with Amazon Alexa.
Yeah, well, I started when I was really young, like around 8 years old, and I started playing with what's a language called Logo. Probably all people heard about it, right? So it was like a small turtle, and you basically learn programming, right, with that. And I got hooked immediately, with computers. And then I started, kept playing with it for a long time. Then decided to go to university, and I had my master's degree in computer systems. And when I finished, I started working for, let's say, boring companies like, insurance, banking, etc. And I say, no, this is not the way to go. This is not what I like. So I started to work for startups. I find the opportunities to start working for startups. And recently I joined Amazon, and one of the things that I like about Amazon is that even though it's a really, really huge company with tons of employees, when you work for a specific team or a specific organization, it kind of feels like a startup, So that's what I really like about Alexa, If you compare us with AWS, for example, AWS is a huge organization within Amazon, right? Alexa is a little bit smaller, but it's super interesting. So I'm really glad that I joined Amazon. And Alexa is super interesting because I also have a background in mobile development. I used to do Android development, and I was getting really tired about graphical user interfaces. Basically, when I had to do a mobile application, I dreaded the part where I had to do the GUI, So that's why I decided to to join voice. This has been very exciting. There's no GUI except if you start using, APL, which is our Alexa presentation language, to kind of deal with the GUI, but mostly the interaction is voice first, right? So you focus on voice, and that's what you have to deal with, and that's what I'm really interested about. How a user interface has to be peculiar because it's based on voice, and there are no graphical cues. So that's super interesting to me. That's why I joined Amazon.
And as a technical evangelist at Amazon, what is your kind of role? What is it that you do then with Alexa on a daily basis?
I recently tweeted about it. I heard Ian Massingham, which is a huge, evangelist in the AWS organization. He basically said that the main task of an evangelist is about efficient knowledge transfer. So our task is to make sure that what we know and what we study and what we develop, right, gets transferred into people's brains effectively, right? So we are always looking for ways to actually achieve that, and that's our main task, our main goals. We have many tools, we have many ways of doing that. We have workshops, we have videos. Actually, Andrea created a series of videos of building your first Alexa skills from scratch that are super successful. But there are many ways in which you can do that, right? And our ultimate goal is to make sure that people understand and people feel comfortable developing skills.
Andrea, what about yourself then? How did all of your kind of traveling from the USA to China to Luxembourg, how did voice come into all of this, and what got you into voice?
So taking the long route like Herman did, everything started with the C++ for Dummies book back when I was, more or less like 9 or 10, which I promptly got bored with and just never looked again at because C++ was way over my head, especially for a young kid. And the rest of my, let's say, upbringing was more on the economic side, although I always had a sort of a passion for building things. So I would say my biggest passion is not necessarily to code, but it's to build things and to create things that haven't existed before. So I would always code on the side and have both a UI and as well as a UX, as well as a coding, sort of hacking things together, not because I like to code, but because I like to bring things to life. And I started in Amazon actually on the business side. So I was finishing my master's in economics and I had to do an internship somewhere. So I applied to Amazon, and I quickly got bored of Excel, and I quickly got bored of emails, or solely working on Excel and email. And so I was looking for ways to sort of combine the coding part and the creative part with, Amazon, which was a great company. And I found that they had an opening for a technical evangelist, which I had already known about technical evangelists because I very much follow very closely the whole tech scene. And I was like, wow, this type of role exists in Amazon. Wow, okay, I'm going to try and apply for this. So I applied, and this goes a long way to show, what sort of company Amazon is. But I had nothing on paper to prove that I would be a good evangelist, but they were willing to take a shot with me. And in the end, everyone's happy so far. And I kind of was able to try this new thing, and so far it's been really good. So I would say the biggest fascination with voice, kind of what like Herman said, is not having to worry so much about the implementation details, because building a good skill is quite technically simple. But the challenge is building a good experience, a natural experience. And that's where you don't need to have technical chops in order to do it well. You need to actually sit back and think, okay, how would a human say this? How would a human interact with this? How would a human respond to a specific question? And how do we make it simple? And how do we work around all the technological constraints that are inherent to something that is just started, right? So like the whole voice assistance industry is relatively new, and we're still figuring things out as we go, and we're still launching tons of new features as we go. And we, as the creators and as the, let's say the people in charge of inspiring other creators, we kind of have to find ways of working around the current constraints, knowing that these constraints may completely evaporate in the future as new features get released. So I would say it's just an exciting place to be in, and the job is super fun. You get to meet a lot of new people. You get to do stuff like this podcast, which I'm sure if I was still on the business side, trying to, get books on Kindle, I'm sure, Kane, you wouldn't have invited me to this podcast. So overall, I'd say it's been a great ride so far.
Wicked. Well, it might be an interactive audio book, mightn't it? might have happened.
Yeah, but you wouldn't have known me. Right?
True.
You would have just been, oh, cool, there's this book that I wanted on Kindle. Great.
That's true. We actually met, I think the first time we met was last year, wasn't it? At I think Seeing a Carhen put the event on at Imperial College London.
Right.
And you were given the kind of keynote there. And I think that was the first time we sort of met each other. It was a good kind of event. That. Dustin, I don't think we've got into how you got into development. What's your kind of, if you take it back far enough, what kind of got you into it then?
Oh man, it's a little embarrassing. I made websites. You can't see, but I'm finger quoting here. Websites about the NBA and PowerPoint when I was 8-9 years old. Moved on to free websites about baseball and things like that. I think I had one about yo-yos at one point. Studied government in college, interned on Capitol Hill for a little bit, realized definitively that was not for me, and then bounced around a little bit until I got into the programming game and realized it's really where I should have been all along. So I think, similar kind of stories as we're hearing here, but it maybe took me a little bit longer, and now that I'm here, I'm holding on tight.
Classic. Andrea, you mentioned there that one of the things that excites you most about voice and about Amazon Alexa is that it's not just about building something, it's about actually creating an experience. And, we're going to talk about localization today and internationalizing skills. Is that something that makes that process a challenge or harder if you need to create an experience in a different language?
Absolutely. So, when you build an app, you have your interface, which is, let's say, the structure. And then you have the text, which is just a clarification of that structure, or it's just almost an embellishment, because if you use symbols effectively, then you can kind of create an app without even writing a single word. Obviously, there are exceptions, but you get what I mean, right? With voice, the whole experience is based on what you write or what you want the assistant to say or what you record a voice actor to say back. And so when you're trying to localize or adapt one experience in one language, you're not just considering the text that has been written for that language, but you're considering the whole backdrop of culture and inside knowledge of that culture and just style and tone and context of that culture, because the way I see a language is it's a result of hundreds or thousands of years of a single culture. A specific word in one language, even if it's translated one-to-one to another language, has a slightly different emotional feeling. And I know this because I'm bilingual in Italian and English, and it's very hard to convey very specific words from one language to the other, because the same word that has the same meaning on the dictionary in another language has a slightly different connotation. So when you're trying to localize these experiences, it's not just a matter of translating, it's a matter of adapting. So transcreation, adapting a message from one language to another, but trying to maintain its intent, style, tone, and context. That's where it's really that's where it's really challenging. So not only that, but that's only assuming that you have a one-to-one map of every word of every language to every other word in every other language. Unfortunately, languages don't work that way. So sometimes we have to think of explanations in one language to define one word that sums up that concept perfectly in that particular language, right? And so you have to deal with the fact that languages don't map one-to-one, that if you use cultural references in one language, or you use, common interjections or phrases that are a common way of expressing, like break a leg. If you translate break a leg, literally, you're going to offend a lot of people in a lot of different languages. So trying to maintain that consistency while keeping the same style and tone, that's where the real challenge is in trying to localize an experience that's inherently based on the human connection that is done through language.
Yep, I would have to agree with that. First of all, the interesting aspect here is that there's this blur between the content and the structure, right? When it comes to a voice interface, and so you have to kind of create an experience that combines both, combines what you want to say plus a structure that is, let's say, comfortable for the user in terms of voice, right? And then when it comes to cultural differences, this is a huge. When it comes to cultural differences, this is a huge point here that Andrea is making. Is that, for example, suppose that there are ways to say hi or to say goodbye in a language that are perfectly fine, right? That maybe are considered impolite or like too informal in some other culture, some other languages, right? So when you go to a direct one-to-one translation, you run into those issues. And if you prepare your voice interaction model to understand a set of, let's say, utterances or phrases, that's how we call them, right? Maybe you got them right for English, for example, because you know that people tend to ask those questions in that way with that structure. And when you translate them, maybe, and you put that experience into, I don't know, a Japanese skill, for example, the people in Japan, maybe they don't ask for that in that way, right? In those ways. So you run into this very, very difficult issues where you cannot do a one-to-one translation. You definitely need to take a look at the culture and how they talk, etc. So if you are, for example, if you have great skills built in English, right, or built for the US, for example, it doesn't mean that you can just go ahead and translate them and put them in Japan, for example. It's going to be very, very challenging. So you have to know what you're doing, right? It's not that easy. So having said that, I don't want to discourage people to actually localize skills. We've been doing this for a while. There are multiple ways in which you can do it, but that's something you definitely have to have in mind.
Do you ever have a situation where, let's say, the same request, so to speak, translator request might go to different functionality, or maybe even in different locales, functionality just doesn't make sense from one to the other? What I'm thinking about here, for example, is languages where the same word means hello and goodbye. Are there situations where you need to account for those types of things and change up what that functionality is?
Well, fortunately, when you are working with Alexa skills, for example, we work with what we call intents, right, at a high level. Basically, it's something that the user wants to do, right? Or you can consider it like a functionality within the skill, right? And a specific functionality. And when you're creating these utterances or these phrases, you have to make sure that they do not overlap. Basically, you do not want to have the same utterances in different intents, because the system would not know, where to go, right, or what to do. So those problems are probably going to become apparent once you do this translation into these other languages. Suppose that you do this translation into this other language where hello and goodbye are maybe said in the same way. Just suppose that hypothetically, right? You would see that those two utterances are the same and they are on different intents, right? So you would immediately catch those kinds of mistakes, right? But you have to check for that. You know what I'm saying? Basically, after going through a localization, maybe changing phrases, changing utterances, etc., you have to make sure that you do not have inconsistencies that arise after the localization process or the translation process.
And we'll get further into some of the detail in terms of how to go about doing all this stuff and some of the kind of processes that you use and that you're kind of evangelizing about at Amazon Alexa. But if we just back up for a second and kind of for those people listening, lots of people listening to this podcast who've created Alexa skills, but lots of people who are in the process of creating Alexa skills. I'm just looking on, this is just on Wikipedia, and it's saying as of November 2018, the Echo is available in 40 countries. Now, if that isn't enough to inspire people to start thinking about localizing their Alexa skills, what would you say is the reasons why people should seriously be considering, or not even considering, but going through the process of localizing their skills? Why?
So currently the way the Alexa Skills Kit and the Alexa Skills Store works is that when you build a skill, you have to build it in one language, right? So whether it be British English or US English or German or Japanese, you build it in one language and you publish it to that specific store. So that alone should prompt people to say, hey, wait, if I build it in UK English, then how do I not get access to the US English store? Or I want to build it in UK English, but I also want Germany to be able to use my skill. Therefore, you need to be able to localize it. And this factor of trying to access all of these new languages is just going to keep increasing as Alexa launches in more and more languages in more and more countries. The easiest way to let's say capture currently the easiest way to capture most markets is to write it in English as if you're trying to account for all English speaking locales, right? So for US, UK, India in English, and then Australia, and then make an interaction model. So build your skill trying to account for all of these cultural differences, because if someone is in the UK, they're probably going to ask for something in a slightly different way than someone in the US or someone in Australia. Try and build a robust interaction model that accounts for everything, and then use the same one throughout all of these different languages. However, going from that to a completely different language, so let's say going from English, generic English, to German, that requires a complete rehaul of what you've done, because everything is different, right? It's not like a UI where you just have to change the strings. You have to change the whole back and forth conversation. To your question, which is why should people localize their skills? I would say short answer is you can untap different countries and different users all over the world by doing it, and you can only do that by localizing your skills. That's the number one reason.
And is there, let's say, for example, if I go into the Alexa Skills Kit in a console at the moment, and I create a skill, and I go to publish it in English in England and in English in America, is there, I don't know quite because I've never done this particular thing, but is there anything preventing me from submitting an English language skill to Germany? Or does it need to be a German speaking skill?
Yeah, well, basically, when you create the skill, right, you can define the scope for the distribution of the skill. So basically, you can limit it to specific countries, or you can say go worldwide, right? Now, suppose that you created your skill only for English US, right? And that's it. And you selected distribute worldwide. That skill is going to be available anywhere where the device is supporting English from the US, okay? That device is maybe somewhere else, right? Not in the US, but basically you will be able to run that skill or use that skill in that device. So when you go global, nothing prevents you from going global, but you have to understand that your selection of languages are the ones that you do support are going to limit the distribution of that skill. Okay, so that's what I think it's really important to understand. Now, some people have country restrictions because they are creating a skill that is super local. Suppose that is a skill for the train service in Spain, right? Why would I want want it to be available somewhere else. Basically, people are using trains here, and they are going to use it here, right? So I can maybe limit the distribution to Spain, so that skill doesn't show up on other Spanish-enabled devices, right? That are somewhere else in the world.
I also think Kane was asking if it's possible to just copy and paste the English skill, put it into the German language, and try to publish it as is, right, Kane?
Yeah.
So
obviously that would be a terrible experience.
Yes, that would be a terrible experience. And your question was, technically, is it possible? And so technically, you can get as far as the certification process, because the certification process will ensure that the skill meets certain standards, and standard number one is it's in the language that it says it is. So I think in development, it would be a nice fun experiment, because the way that Alexa works, right, is if you write a foreign word in that language. So, for example, if I were to write "Hello, how are you" in the Italian language, then Alexa, using Italian phonetics and Italian ways of speaking, will try to interpret that phrase, and coincidentally will sound like an Italian's trying to speak English. So it will be a fun experiment, but it won't be very successful in the certification process.
Right. So if I have an English-speaking skill and I put an Italian phrase in there, then it will be read back by Alexa, the English Alexa trying to speak Italian.
Exactly.
So presumably, right. So there's different kind of versions, if you like, of Alexa that are tuned for different locales.
And it's actually very funny, to hear that. If you ever try it, it's very, very funny. And we have, let's say, Alexa voices for each locale, right? So if you hear, for example, Alexa speaking in English from Britain, it will sound completely different to the Alexa in the US, right? So we have different voices, definitely. But one thing that I wanted to clarify here is that there are two different things here. One thing is the output of the skill, so basically what the skill says, right? And that you obviously need to localize. And a different thing is what the skill basically understands, right? Which is the voice interaction model. And when you create these phrases, these utterances, it's basically you are defining what the skills needs to understand, right? So sometimes you start by localizing we call it the front end, the voice interaction model. Okay, there are two parts of the skill: the front end and the back end. The front end is basically what the skill needs, what the skill needs to understand when the user speaks, okay? So you start by localizing the front end, and maybe you do a great work at localizing the front end, but then when that skill hits the back end, all the responses are being sent, for example, in English. Suppose it's a hello world that was created in English. Those responses are sent in English. And then you have your, let's say, Spanish-speaking Alexa trying to speak in English, those words. So localization is not only about localizing the voice interaction model, but it's about localizing the voice interaction model and the backend, these two parts, okay? Usually when you create the front end, if you are, for example, working here in Spain, you just choose the language that you want to work with when you create this front-end voice interaction model. So if I'm here in Spain, I just select Spanish from Spain. Okay, we also have Spanish from Mexico to give you an idea. But if I want to create these different versions for different languages in this front-end, I have to explicitly create voice interaction models for each locale. Okay, so if I want a skill to be able to work in Spain and in the US, for example, in English, I will have to create two voice interaction models, one for Spain and another one for English US. And those will coexist, right? And if I, for example, update the voice interaction model for Spain, then the English model gets outdated. Basically, I need to also go to the voice interaction model for English US and update it, right, in the same way. With the backend, things are a little bit different, because when we localize it, what we do is use a single backend, right? We're not using multiple backends to support multiple languages. We use a single backend, and we detect the locale that comes from the device. So when the device sends a request to the backend, it's always sending this piece of information that is specifying the locale of the device. So it's telling me if it's English US or if it's, for example, Spanish from Spain. In the backend, we detect this locale, and based on that, we select the specific strings that we want to output. So in the backend, we need these different strings. We need strings in English, we need strings in Spanish, right? And depending on that locale, we select those and we send them out, right? So that's a way in which we achieve that the backend doesn't speak in English to a Spanish device, for example.
Are there any advantages to essentially localizing the same skill versus having discrete skills for each locale?
So the advantage, I would say it's a matter of choice. The advantage of keeping everything under one backend is that you update the code logic once, and as long as your strings are managed in a way that they can be picked regardless of locale, you can just focus on the code logic in your backend, and once you update it once, it works for all languages, right? If you duplicate your function or your backend for each language, then anytime you want to make a change, you also have to propagate it to every other language. And it also makes it easier to accidentally sort of deviate into different branches as you try to accommodate each different culture or each different language, because you want to add maybe an interaction here, an interaction there. So I would say the biggest benefit of having a single backend that manages locales automatically is that you can just focus on the code once, and then you can just focus on the strings without any, let's say, redundancy.
There's also an interesting thing to consider when it comes to the advantages of creating separate skills versus creating one skill with multiple locales. So let me give you an example. Suppose that you create a skill called catfax, right? And you create catfax for the US, and you create a separate skill called catfax in Spanish for Spain, right? So you have two separate skills. You're not creating one with multiple locales, but you are creating two separate skills. One thing that usually happens is that when you submit a skill for publication, you need to pass a certification process, right? So Amazon checks the skills to make sure they comply with all our guidelines. And when you do that for a skill that supports multiple locales, basically all the locales have to be checked, and all the locales have to be okay in terms of guidelines for the skill to be published. So when you submit a multi-local skill, they usually tend to take a longer time to pass the certification because you have multiple checks there, right? Well, if you have separate skills, the certification process basically checks one locale, the one for each skill, right? So maybe if you know that you're going to run into, a lot of these tedious checks for a skill that has multiple locales, maybe it is worth to have separate ones, but you run into the issues that Andrea mentioned, right? Of keeping everything up to date and synchronized.
And just to clarify for those listening, in terms of those who might not be developers, when you say a front end and back end, are you talking about the front end being your kind of intents and your slot values, and your back end being your kind of lambda functions?
Yeah, I think I can clarify that. So let's suppose that you start interacting with a skill, right? You talk to Alexa and you say, Alexa, open catfax, right? So basically, when you start talking to the skill, you can say, give me a fact, right? This is a very, very simple example. So basically, that's an utterance, right? You're saying, give me a fact, okay? There's a model that is trying to understand what you say, okay? So you can say, give me a fact, you can say, I want a pizza, you can say whatever, right? Some of those phrases or utterances are going to be, let's say, supported by your model. Basically, your model will understand some of them. There are a lot of them that will not, and the model will not understand, okay? So that part is called the front end. We call it the voice interaction model. So it defines the understanding of the skill, okay? Now, that model acts like a filter, because that model is trying to make trying to understand what you really want to do based on those phrases, right? There are multiple ways in which you can say that you want to hear a fact. You can say, I want a fact, I want to hear a specific piece of data, multiple ways in which the user might say the same thing. But basically, the model simplifies this process by basically matching that into an intent. So the intent is what the user really wants to do. When we hit the backend, which is the part that actually is going to process, that output from the front end, when we hit the backend, we don't want to basically overwhelm the developer in the backend with the whole variations of what the user is saying, with whole phrases, etc. So what we want to basically do is tell the backend the user wants to do X, right? So that's an intent. It's very specific. In the backend, that's what you get, right? And then in the backend, you decide what the skill needs to say back to the user. So it's more about the output of the skill, what the user ends up doing, what kind of data the skill has to retrieve, to give an answer back to the user. So those are the difference between front end and back end. I hope that makes it clear. I don't know if you have more questions, just ask.
Yeah. No, I think it makes it clear. So the front end is essentially all of your utterances and all of your sample dialogue phrases and all of that kind of stuff. And then the back end is kind of amalgamating those into one intent, which is check the weather in this location. And then the back end is all of the handling of that and producing the response back. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of touched on this in parts here and there, but I'm wondering whether we can kind of go through. If someone has an Alexa skill, it's in English US or French or whatever the language is, what's the process that you would advise them to go through to turn that skill into another language, into changing one skill from one language into kind of localizing it for another locale? What's the kind of process you'd recommend they go through?
I would point them to Andrea's blog about localization.
And given that the author is speaking right now, maybe I can I can summarize it. Okay, so let's say you've built a skill and you haven't thought about localization at all, right? So you've hard-coded all of your strings in your code logic, and you've just built it in one language. So the steps are, I would say, three broad steps. The first one is to rewrite your front end, your interaction model, into the target language, right? So if we're going from, for example, French to German or English to French or whatever, you have to adapt all of the phrases that you expect a user to say into that target language. And with things like, going from French to German, the whole sentence structure may change. Even potentially slot types and values may change as well, because, for example, dates are expressed in a specific way in one language versus another. So you just have to understand how to port the experience, the front-end experience, so how users express themselves from one language to the other. And that practically just entails translating the interaction model. But it's not just translating, right? Because as we said, as I mentioned earlier, it's more than translating, it's transcreation. So trying to keep the same feel, tone, context, culture, but in the new target language. So that's why it's not just a matter of translation, but it's a matter of readaptation into that target language. And some languages may have different tones. So maybe a German audience expects a more formal tone. Hopefully I'm not stereotyping. Or a UK audience expects a slightly more formal tone than a US audience. And that's just based on your personal judgment and based on how well you know the target audience. So let's say you translate your front end, so you know what users will say. Your skill is trained to recognize the phrases that you expect users to say in that target language. The intents stay the same. So the actual connection points between what users say and what your skill does, our intents, remain intact. But the skill backend also has to respond in that target language, right? So even though it's funny to have Alexa speak a different language in a bad accent, it's better to speak to the user back in the right language. And to do that, we have to sort of extrapolate the text and the strings from our code and divide it in. These are our language assets. So these are what our skill says, and we put them to one side. And this is what our skill does. So for example, connect to an API, or retrieve information from a database, or perform some calculations. and you separate these two things, and you manage them separately. Now, there's various ways of managing the code. We were talking earlier about having a single function or a single backend that executes the code and just pulls the different languages based on what type of request is coming in. That's one design decision. The other design decision is to have multiple backends for each language, and they are intrinsically tied to a specific language, right? That's just a design choice. I would tend to prefer having one single backend that can adapt to various languages so that you only update the code once. So let's assume the code part for the moment is taken care of, and you've somehow, instead of hard coding the strings in your responses, you're using variables to reference a specific string. Now comes the issue of having to manage different languages. So now you have a single skill backend, but you have two languages and maybe 3 or 4 or 5. How do you manage this? So there's a couple of ways to do this. You can do it by hand. So you can write your, we have this thing called interceptors in the new SDK where any request that comes in can be pre-processed somehow, and you can check what the incoming locale is and pick the right language strings from that from your language assets, and then use that in your skill. So using an interceptor and writing it on your own, we have in the blog post how to localize your Alexa skill, and we have a lot of sample code on github.com/Alexa on how to do this yourself. But there's also some interesting alternatives. So for example, Jargon, they are writing an SDK that's open source, and they also sort of abstract away the need to micromanage your language assets. So for those of you who are developers, you wrap your Alexa skill builder object around the Jargon SDK, and they implicitly take care of the language, and you just have to follow their way of writing speech output and their way of formatting your strings into a separate file, and they take care of the rest. And they make it easy to pluralize. They make it easy to take care of multiple versions.
Yep, but the common theme here, when you use Jargon or INTNext, whatever tool you use in the backend, the common thing here is that you have string resources, right? And those string resources have a particular form, which is key and value, right? So the value has the actual string in a specific language, right? While the key is the same for all languages. So suppose that I have a welcome message, right? I have string resources where welcome equals hello for English, and then I have Spanish resources where welcome, which is exactly the same key, I use English in the key, right? But equals to hola, right? So, and that's a different value within that key. So all these tools, INTNext, Jargon, etc., makes it really easy to actually transparently pick the strings depending on the locale. So when I'm working with the backend, I would basically say, hey, Alexa, you need to speak welcome using the welcome key, okay? So the system will just go and fetch the specific value for that key, taking into account the locale. It will pick hello if it's an English request, or it will pick hola if it's a request in Spanish, okay, or from Spanish device. So that's the basic logic behind it.
This is just a clarification essentially, and then I'll jump in. Just to let me kind of summarize this and just clarify this in my mind to see if I've got it right. So the first thing you would do is you would take all of your utterances and your the spoken words by the user, all of those things that you've got that you would expect the user to say, you would translate those first. So let's say I've got all of those in my left hand, and I translate everything in my left hand, which is everything that the user is going to say. And then the code, which is sitting on my lap, is the stuff that's handling all of the logic and responses. So what I want to do is I want to go through that logic, find out all of the points where my responses are, take those from the code which is on my lap and put them all into my right hand and translate all of those. And then the options are that... before I move on, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, it is correct. The thing is that you don't hold all the language resources on the same place, because when you translate the voice interaction model, that model is going to be in the front end, right? And the strings that you're translating in the back end, they will have to be accessible from the back end, so they are in a different place. Okay, but basically you got it right? That's the process. Yes.
Okay, so and then what happens is, one of the ways in which you can do it is that, let's say that I've got my English utterances and my translated utterances now, let's say German, in my left hand, the logic's sitting on my lap, and the responses that are coming from the skill are in my right hand. And then Dustin comes along and he speaks something in French. Am I right in thinking that the way you explained handling that would be that essentially when that utterance comes through in French, the logic part that's sitting on my lap will understand via a token or something that is French, and then it will go away and pick out the translation in French in my right hand and then serve that through the skill?
Exactly. Yeah. So every request has a locale string, like the ISO codes like IT-IT or EN-GB or EN-US, right? And if you can do this by hand. There's libraries and there's sample code that you can use to do this automatically. But if you pick that locale and you structure your strings in a way that are grouped by this locale string, then you can easily filter them and pick the right ones. So yes, exactly.
Yep. But I would like to make a clarification here, which I think it's important. When you have a device, right? Suppose you have an Amazon Echo, you configure it for a specific language. Okay. So when you onboard the device with the app, you basically tell the device, okay, you're going to be Spanish for Spain, or you're going to be English US, right? Now, if someone comes and speaks in a different language, right, the device is not going to understand. So right now we don't have something dynamic to actually detect the locale dynamically when you speak to a device that is not configured for your language. We don't have that yet, okay? So basically the device is going to try to understand what you're saying. So put that the device is configured for Spanish for Spain and you speak in French, the device is going to try to understand that as if it were Spanish, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense, yeah.
So you guys mentioned a couple of tools. You mentioned Jargon, who we spoke with recently. I believe that podcast gain is going to come out right before this one, perhaps. And you also mentioned I-18 Next as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of times developers will, vary their responses or maybe provide escalating responses if someone's asking for something that's unavailable multiple times in a row. Is that possible to do with these localization tooling as well?
Absolutely. So both of these support, like a random picking from an array. So if instead of having a simple key value pair of this is the variable and this is what you should say if that variable is called, you can have this is the variable and this is an array of responses that you can use to address it. And those sentences can also have wildcards in them that you can then fill up or fill in at execution time with whatever data you're processing at that moment. So for example, if you have a string that says, oh, you have X number of coins, right? It would be very impractical to have a version of that string for every number of coins, or it would be very impractical to have that sentence split up so that at execution time you can fill in it. You can concatenate them with the value in the middle. So these tools allow you to have strings with placeholders in them that then you can then fill in with values as you're running the backend code. So it's definitely possible. And I've actually recently gotten a Twitter request of someone who wanted to use the localization method, but also have not just random picking from an array, but also, as you said, escalating. So first I want to use this sentence, then if something doesn't happen or this happens, then I want to use that sentence, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe a sorted array. And in that case, you can do it as well. So what I recommended that particular developer to do is to augment the localization interceptor. And in his case, he was using I18 next. So basically, we're using the interceptor to add a localization function at the request time, right? And create another one that instead of randomly picking from an array, instead goes through the array and picks the value based on a session attribute or based on a value in the database that the developer has stored. So for example, if you've accessed the skill 10 times, rather than say the first value of an array that's like, hey, welcome to this skill, blah, 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 the 10th time it would be, hey, welcome back. Or welcome back again. Wow, you come here a lot, right? And just tailor the experience that way.
Yeah, and on top of that, these tools also allow you, or these libraries also allow you to define fallback mechanisms. So suppose that there's an incoming request, you're trying to find a specific key for a phrase, right? And the key is not available, right? Suppose you run into that situation. You have fallback mechanisms to actually, pick something else. And that's good because usually, for example, when I localize a skill and I'm dealing with multiple English locales. Suppose I have a skill that is for the English US and English UK. I only provide a few strings that are specific for the UK, right? In my skills. A lot of them I can reuse because they're basically the same thing. So I can say that the skill should use English in general, right? As a general family, use English, and only use those as specific for the UK when the locale is UK. You can play with that, do stuff like that. So it's very flexible.
Yeah. And sorry, I just wanted to complete the loop because we talked about just a simple translation, which unfortunately is not that simple. And Kane was asking earlier, what's the complete process? So I just wanted to close the picture because yes, you do translate on one hand the interaction model, then you extrapolate the strings and you put them on your other hand and you translate those. But what happens when you make changes to your skill, or what happens when things change? So the important thing to remember when you're localizing skills is when things change, you have to change it for every language, and you have to keep adapting every language to those changes. So it's an ongoing process. So it's very important to understand that, because really when you're localizing your skills to another language, it's sort of like a responsibility you have, right? You can't just put it into the German skill store and then just keep focusing on the US one and then ignore the German one, because as you make changes, those changes have to be propagated also to the German store. And that's something that people underestimate, but you should definitely keep in mind that it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, and I have another step of the process, which is right in the end, which is not obvious at all, but it becomes obvious once you have a successful skill published, right? And what usually happens is that when you have a skill that really works, you get feedback, right? And you get support requests, right? And suppose you have localize your skills to your English US skill to Spanish, right? And that skill becomes very successful in Spain. Maybe you start getting support requests or a request to basically create new features, etc., in Spanish, right? So you have to take care of that and have that in mind, that you will also get a response from the people in this other locale or in this other country. So if you do not have people to actually take care of that, you are in trouble. Okay.
Yeah. And last step. So this is a competition on who can get the latest step. I would say it's not necessarily the last step, but definitely something that you will realize as Herman was saying, as you get more and more popular, you're going to have to manage a lot of different languages, a lot of different strings. And as you grow your content, those strings just keep growing, right? So you need to start finding ways of not just having a file that you personally edit every time you want to make a change, but of transitioning that file into perhaps a community-sourced file, right? Mm-hmm. Using services like Crowdin, or even Jargon has their own platform that allows you to, source translations based on your strings. So finding methods of effectively
Scaling.
delegating the translation, not just so that you have to do it yourself, but people can contribute corrections, can contribute edits, can contribute even other content, for example, right? So let's say you make an Airtable, I don't know how they call it, but an Airtable table, right? And you can have like a table that's just for questions in that particular language, and you have a table where you can specify what the question is, what the correct answers are. Sorry, what the questions are, and what the correct answer is, for example.
Airtable is like a crossing of a spreadsheet and a database that you can access via API. Just for clarification.
Yeah, and you can have other people contribute in that language, so you don't have to constantly depend on your translators to just one-to-one adapt what's available in your source locale, right? You have content that grows organically into different locales without having to worry about having everything completely synchronized. So those are various considerations that are definitely challenging, but I think it's a great problem to have when you have to start thinking about, okay, how do I scale, right?
Yeah, I don't have another one, so I think Andrea won this one.
Well played, Andrea.
Ones that we didn't talk about was testing. How can developers, how can builders go about testing the different locales?
We need another podcast for that one.
Okay.
I would say. But yes, there are multiple ways in which you can test. We have multiple tools, both in the front-end side and on the back-end side. For example, quite recently, we launched what we call the utterance profiler that allows you to test the voice interaction model alone without even hitting the backend. Okay, so you can start playing with those phrases and see how they map into intents, how you collect slots. Slots are the variables, that are part of these utterances, etc. And you have to do a lot of work on the front end side, but then there are excellent tools in the back end to actually create a kind of a stack for testing, to do unit testing, etc. We have the simulation. We have multiple tools.
So yeah, let me maybe rephrase that a different way. Are there any specific localization considerations when it comes to testing?
Okay, yeah. So I mean, the biggest one is automation, because simply due to a physical constraint, right, that you can't rely on yourself being able to test in every language that you're coding in or that you're supporting, and the devices that you have in your home are really only made to be conversed with, at least for now, in one specific language. So if you start localizing skills and then you expect to have the same testing experience that you have at home, where you can just talk to the device or write in the simulator, then you're going to have a hard time, because not only is it very difficult to just continuously change languages of your physical device, but you also would need to manually type out everything in the developer console, for example, in every language that you're supporting. So being able to effectively automate the testing, I would say, is the key to success with localization. And as Herman was mentioning, we have tools for this. We have the Ask CLI that allows you to specify what locale you want to use and what sentence you want to use to test. Then you can use the incoming response of that test to check whether it fits certain criteria, therefore creating a sort of a unit test that you build for each language. And then every time you make a change, you just run the series of tests, and boom, you see if there's a regression, or if there's a new issue that comes up. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Dustin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think automation is key there. I mean, I totally agree with Andrea, because if you think about the alternative, it's just not doable. We have people. I've seen people testing skills in a language that they do not know, right? Just typing strings maybe in German in some web service, where the service would output the spoken MP3, right, and they would play it to the echo, so they could actually launch the skill, pass an utterance, etc., which is just crazy, right? So you don't want to go into that.
No. That does sound mental. Well, guys, this has been an absolute pleasure. Sorry it's taken up a little bit more of your time than it was supposed to, but it's been an absolute joy listening to all of this discussion and being a part of this discussion. I think that I knew that we would cover stuff that wasn't on the radar, and I think we've done exactly that. And I think that the explanation of how to go about translating Alexa skills from beginning to end and all of the technical considerations has been absolutely immense. So thank you so much for joining us, chaps. Where can people? I'll put the links to the blog post from yourself, Andrea, on how to localize your Alexa skills. I'll also link to the videos on YouTube and Twitch and the GitHub Alexa repository. Where else can people go to either learn more about this or to kind of follow what you guys are doing at Amazon Alexa?
I would say the 3 Twitter channels to follow is at Alexa Devs, where you can stay up to date with the latest features, because we keep rolling out new ones, and our personal Twitter accounts that you can use as help, advice, or general questions. My DMs are open, or you can tweet me at Muttoni A, and Herman. What's your Twitter account, Herman?
Herman Viscuso.
Herman Viscuso, and Kane, maybe you can share those as well. But any way that you can reach out to us is great. And if you have specific technical questions, you can also write it in the forums. So alexa.design/forums, which is maintained by our developer advocacy group, who check the forums and try to provide support. And if you have a specific issue that you want like a one-to-one help with, and you don't want to post it in the forums, then you can also contact us officially using alexa.design/contact us. Yeah.
Also, if I might add, I think that some of the guys listening might want to check the source code of the specific skills that have been localized using some of the techniques we describe here. So if you guys want to check that, you should go to github.com/Alexa, where there are multiple skills there that are using these techniques and are being localized. Yeah,
I would say that the top 2, because they're also simple, is the fact skill and the how-to skill. Those both use the i18 Next version, and I know that Jargon have also kind of ported those same samples into jargonized versions. So if you're trying to compare the two, feel free to check out their versions. I'm sure if you go on jargon.com, you'll find links to them. And yeah, in general, we're here to help. So any way that we can help, please feel free to reach out, and we'll try our best.
And we really like to talk about this stuff. So Kane, thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Andrea, Herman, thank you so much. That was Andrea Muttoni and Herman Viscuso. Wow, that was epic. Absolutely over the moon to have those chaps along to discuss this topic. It's a topic that whenever we've done a podcast that touches on this, we did one with Micah Defua, we did one with Jargon, and every single time it resonates, and people are always reaching out and getting in touch and saying how valuable that content is, because the echoes are on sale in over 40 different countries. How many different languages does the world speak? It's absolutely unbelievable. I know there's, looking at the stats and how much you can believe, I don't know, but looking at the stats, it would seem as though the vast majority of skills at the moment are in US English or UK English. And, Germany, huge market over in Germany. There's a huge voice scene over there. Same for Spain, same for France. The Netherlands, Holland, it's starting to really, really grow over there. Australia, as Andrea mentioned, there is so much potential for developers, designers, and brands to localize their voice experiences and capitalize and tap into current untapped market. Well, I say untapped, it's not actually untapped, it's all going on, it's all happening, so the sooner you can kind of do it, the better it'll be. Really, really like the way that Andrea explained the process of going through the translation situation, because, and there's a rhyme for you as well, because I finally kind of get it now. When we spoke to Jargon, I got the Jargon tool, and I got what Jargon are all about and how they help, and I got the concept of separating content from code. But I think that what I finally did today was manage to visualize it in my head, And I think the example I give was having the utterances and the user-spoken utterances in your left hand and translating those so that you've got everything that goes into the skill translated. And then you've got the logic sitting on your lap, and the logic has got all of your responses in it. You then take those responses, the strings as Andrea was calling it and Herman were calling it, the English strings, for example, and you move those into your right hand, and then you translate that over there. So you essentially, it's like a funnel going down and then a funnel coming back out again. That's the way I'll kind of visualize it. Maybe the cover image for this will be that funnel. So I finally got it straight in my mind, and it doesn't. I know that they were saying that it can be quite complex, and it might be quite complex, but in terms of the principles and the process to follow, I think they explained it in a really simple form. It sounds as though it's doable. I don't think it sounds out of anybody's stretch of the imagination, so to speak. So yeah, that's a good way of explaining it. So thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Herman. Thank you, Dustin, as always. And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you all for listening. Until next time, see you later.